Well, howdy everyone. Today I'm looking at a classic lens indeed, the venerable Canon 50mm f1.4 USM. I originally reviewed this lens over 3 years ago, but since then I've standardized and improved my lens reviews, and I've had a chance to use it even more and compare it to other lenses. This was the first camera lens I ever bought, at the same time as my first digital SLR camera, a little Canon 550D, and this is the first picture I ever took, on a South Korean bus on the journey home. Bit more colourful than the buses in Wales. This lens is a step up from the super cheap Canon 50mm f1.8 lens. It costs nearly 4 times as much money, but it has a maximum aperture that's 66% wider. That means it lets in 66% more light, making it a great lens for low light photography and video work, as you can see here. You can also get an extremely blurry background at f1.4 or narrow depth of field. Here's a picture taken at f5.6, which is the maximum aperture of the regular kit lens that comes with your camera at 50mm, and here's the same picture at f1.4. It's easy to see the enormous difference. The lens is letting in 16 times more light than your kit lens, and the background is 16 times blurrier. There's no doubt that a fast 50mm lens, or any other fast lens, can make a big difference to your photography. On one of Canon's expensive full-frame cameras, 50mm is a nice standard focal length, neither wide-angle nor telephoto, and years ago it used to be the standard kit lens that would come with a film camera before zoom lenses became popular. The angle of view is wide enough to get most scenes into your picture, but zoomed in enough to emphasize your subject really well and give you an out-of-focus background. Personally, I prefer a slightly wider angle, like 35 or 40mm, but everyone has different tastes, and 50mm is undoubtedly very useful. However, if you have one of Canon's less expensive APS-C cameras, which is basically any digital SLR that costs less than £1,000, then you get an angle of view of 80mm instead, as you see here. That's slightly less useful for general purpose photography, as it's more of a short telephoto focal length. So on an APS-C camera, this lens is better at picking out your subjects, which makes it a little more suitable as a portrait lens. It's still a very useful focal length though. As you can see in this footage, there's no image stabilization, which makes your videos a bit shaky, especially on an APS-C camera. Let's look at the lens's build quality. It feels fairly solid to hold, but also quite plasticky. It's not particularly big or heavy, but you definitely feel it on your camera. The front glass element is quite pretty, and it's safely recessed into the lens, so you don't really need to buy a UV filter for protection. The focus ring on this lens started out being fairly smooth, but over the years it's really stiffened up. This is a commonly reported problem for this particular lens. A good point is that the lens has full-time manual focus, so you can turn that focus ring anytime. The focus ring turns a very long path, around 200 degrees. This means you can get some very precise manual focusing, but it can be a bit annoying for handheld filmmaking, as you have to keep turning and turning the focus ring. The autofocus is fairly fast on this lens, as you can see here. When I first got the lens it focused quietly, but now after years of use it makes some noise, unfortunately. Basically, the build quality of the lens is fine, but you can tell it's one of the older lenses in Canon's lineup. It'd be nice to have an update one day with a more durable focus system, and maybe even image stabilization. Well, let's look at picture quality. The optical design of this lens is actually quite old-fashioned, so let's see how it can perform on a modern digital camera. We'll start with a full-frame camera, the 20-megapixel Canon 6D. With the aperture wide open at f1.4, the lens is reasonably sharp in the center of the image, but there are a few complications. If you look in the windows, you can see some purple fringing and ghosting, and generally the contrast of the picture is comparatively weak, certainly not as good as other 50mm lenses I've tested. Things get a bit softer as we look into the corners of the image, as you can see, but the image is just about usable, and we're not really seeing any chromatic aberration, so it's not completely awful, but nothing to write home about either. When we stop down to f2, the corners are a bit brighter and sharper, and the picture quality in the middle of the frame is much better. The contrast levels are now fine, but we are still seeing a little ghosting. Stop the lens down again to f2.8 and picture quality is perfect in the middle of the image, and the corners look a lot better too. Stop down to f4 for another major improvement in the corners, and at f5.6 the lens is finally extremely sharp from corner to corner. It stays sharp until f16. So on a full frame camera, the picture quality is good enough to get the images you need, but it's certainly not impressive, and newer 50mm lenses can do much better. The picture quality at f1.4 is particularly unremarkable. Now let's test it on a far more common APS-C camera, in this case my trusty 18MP Canon 60D. With the aperture wide open at f1.4, the image is noticeably soft in the middle, with poor contrast levels and ghosting and purple fringing, noticeable again in the windows. The corners of the image are even softer. There's still ghosting in the windows, but thankfully no chromatic aberration is visible. Stop down to f2 for a big improvement in sharpness in the corners, and image quality in the middle becomes very good, a lot sharper and punchier than before. Stop down again to f2.8 and the picture quality in the middle becomes perfect, with another improvement in the corners. Stop down to f5.6 for wonderful sharpness levels in the corners. So frankly, the lens is similarly weak on an APS-C camera. If you need good picture quality, then you'll have to stop down to f2, or ideally f2.8. Now let's take a look at vignetting and distortion levels. On an APS-C camera, they're not really a big deal, so let's look at the full frame performance. We're getting some noticeable barrel distortion, which is a bit disappointing for a non-zoom lens. We also get very strong vignetting, or dark corners. This can be fixed with peripheral illumination on your camera, at a cost of slightly lower image quality. Stop the lens down to f2 for lighter corners, and at f2.8 it's no longer really a problem. So it's a slightly below average performance for vignetting and distortion. Another issue is that the lens does not work well against bright light. You get a lot of flaring and even lower contrast levels than before. This is a common issue for lenses designed before digital cameras came out. This lens can give you a very out of focus background, as we saw before. Unfortunately, the actual quality of the bokeh is not particularly nice. As you can see here, the background looks a bit edgy and nervous. When you have quite deep backgrounds, it's not really a problem, but occasionally it can look pretty hideous. Bokeh balls often have colourful or bright outlines, which is the main cause of this problem. You also get a lot of colourful bokeh fringing, also known as longitudinal chromatic aberration. With this lens at f1.4, you can see very strong purple fringing in front of the plane of focus and green behind. You have to stop the aperture down to f4 to get rid of it if it bothers you. It definitely bugs me, but admittedly, it is a common problem for a lot of fast aperture lenses. The lens can focus down to 45cm, which is pretty average. The close-up picture quality at f1.4 is actually not too bad, getting really good at f2 and excellent at f2.8. So overall, I feel a bit torn posting this review. On the one hand, I've owned the Canon 50mm f1.4 for years, and I've loved it and taken most of my best pictures with it, as well as using it for a whole bunch of cool video work. Just by virtue of being a 50mm f1.4 lens, you're going to get great pictures with it. But on the other hand, it's an old lens now, and technically, the picture quality is weak in all kinds of different ways. You have to stop it down to f2.8 to get really nice, sharp pictures. The thing I dislike the most has got to be the unattractive bokeh. Sigma and Zeiss are starting to make much better 50mm lenses now with modern optical designs. So I think it really is time that Canon updated this lens. That way, you can have great technical picture quality to back up those lovely images the lens can give you. If you'd like to find out more, I've compared this lens in a group test video and also against Canon's 50mm f1.2L lens. So click on the links if you want to check those out. Over the years, I've also created one or two other interesting videos with this lens, so feel free to check those out too. God bless.